All right, we can get started then. Hi everyone, welcome to the Open quarterfinals of Malaysia Charity Open 2024. My name is Rafish. I will be the chair for this round. I don't have any specific gender preferred pronouns. With me in panel, I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Adya.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Hi, Sukito, no preferred pronouns.
All right, great. A few housekeeping rules before we start. Firstly, please time yourself. I don't think it will be possible for us to give timestamps, but we will be mentioning to you once you exceed that 8 minute and 15 seconds mark. And secondly, please mention your POI preference before the start of your speech. In an event where a speaker doesn't mention the POI preference, we'll use default chat method. Do not unnecessarily badger the speaker because it disrupts your flow and might lead to the round being delayed. All right. That being said, can we have the Prime Minister to open the affirmative case here?
Okay, I'll be starting my speech as soon as I get my timer up. Okay, sorry for the delay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 4 square feet of space. That is the amount of space that the government believes the average chicken ought to receive. In many cases, these chickens delegated to much less space in order to fit a farmer's demand for eggs. Animal domestication is no less than a prison that was glorified for the benefit towards humans. Regardless of what species of animal you are, Proposition believes that you are entitled towards liberty and freedom. We are so proud to propose. Firstly, some clarification on the model. The opposition defends the status quo, therefore meaning that they can't put any checks or use legislation in order to mitigate the current impacts of domestication, because that is not in the spirit of the motion. And besides, corporate lobbying exists to a large extent in the status quo as of right now. Therefore, they need to give structural reasons as to why animal domestication inherently is good. Okay, so now some framing. We define animal domestication as the process of using animals for human use. For example, factory farms for meat. For example, domesticating pets. For example, animal experimentation. Our world is the natural state of nature where animals exist, like Pokemon or something. To note, even if an animal is killed by wolves, yes, that happens, that is nature. We do not go against that in any way. However, we do note that there are going to be less animals that are abused in the first place. Now, to continue on to characterization, animal domestication is not nice and violates several inherent rights. For example, the right to mobility with chicken farms and selective breeding in pugs, the right to freedom, which is inherently violated by domesticating animals and keeping them in a set area, and thirdly, the right to life when slaughterhouses exist, when the consumption for animal meat still exists. Okay, now a principle and a practical. Or start with my principle. Firstly, how animal domestication is principally immoral. 5 reasons. Firstly, loss of autonomy. It is morally wrong to treat animals as properties or commodities to be used and exploited for human benefit because animals are themselves have a intelligence and therefore have a dignity that should not be abused. Secondly, exploitation. Animal domestication inherently involves exploiting animals for human purposes, such as food, labor, or entertainment, without regard to their intrinsic well being. This leads to obvious psychological and physical harm, as animals are bred, trained, or manipulated to serve human interests exclusively. Thirdly, most importantly, the lack of consent in this process. Domesticated animals inherently do not have the ability to consent to their domestication, as they are bred and raised for human purposes without the input or consideration of their preferences, which means that because of their inherent lack of agency and self determination. Fourthly, the subjective breeding that many animals go through prioritize certain physical traits or behaviors over others, which has two impacts. Firstly, animals are physically manipulated and therefore occasionally have a tendency towards genetic health issues and deformities that would not occur in the natural world, therefore violating their rights. And secondly, have a large psychological harm because of the fact that animals are now being abused in such way. And fifthly, it is morally wrong to treat animals as commodities because the fact there is an inherent value within each animal, even if some animals are indeed benefited over this. This is principally incorrect. If we give mortgages to people solely based off of race, they're going to continue the system and get rich. Inequality spreads, and this is going to be morally incorrect. Okay, now on my practical. Three things. Firstly, the loss of biodiversity. We raise cats and dogs in horrible ways and prioritize certain traits above all others. For example, animal breeding. We have different types of dogs that were all made to suit specific purposes. For example, pugs of horrible defects. This obviously has a lot of issues associated with it, such as the fact that as soon as many species go out of use, they are completely eliminated within nature. Secondly, the mistreatment of animals inherently. For example, even if we say that opposition says that we are severely mischaracterizing this debate, and not all animals are put within horrible factory farms to be abused with for every day of their lives and then subsequently killed for human consumption, then we still believe that those who've gotten the better end of the stick, metaphorically, aka many animals and household pets, simply do not get a choice as well. Because of the fact they inherently have a moral value and do not get a choice, this is principally incorrect. To add on, many owners in the status quo cannot treat animals perfectly. For example, animal abuse exists for a reason, which means on either side, the opposition's case is washed. Even if they are treated well, however, it is not a suitable alternative. If someone, for example, held a gun to your head and forced you to study and work hard, so you got into Harvard and then had a great job, the benefits are outweighed by the moral indignity and fear of having a gun to your head every single day of your life, and therefore any benefits are negated by the sheer fact that it is morally and practically incorrect to treat someone that way. Secondly, on more disease because of the fact that there is extreme contact with animals. Once we have systematic harms, systematic abuses, and systematic contact with animals, there is a large more chance for exposure to disease because of the systematic nature of animal domestication in that status quo. For example, we have zoonotic viruses that are commonly spread, like ringworm from pet dogs. Because of the fact that there is a much larger margin for change and for disease on their side of house, we believe that our side of house, in which we do not systematically support these practices, there is going to be a lot less health consequences for them. And fourthly, there is going to be thirdly, there's a large margin for harm to the environment. We have many abuses in the environment going on. For example, a large portion of farmable land, arable land, is being used for animal farming. This does two things. First of all, it's bad for the environment because of the fact that these animals are being mistreated and exploited to gain as much value as them for as possible. And secondly, it's bad for the environment inherently because of the fact that the environment is being harmed in this. And thirdly, it's bad for humans as well when this land can be used for something so much better. For example, if we used all of the land that we used for beef farming, we would be able to double or triple the output of our food output and therefore allow a lot more people to be fed. This is morally incorrect to be able to exploit animals for human use while also ignoring the opinions and the needs of other human beings. Therefore, we believe that the harm to the environment outweighs anything that you might get. Okay, now for some weighing. Opposition's human benefits are completely outweighed in the status quo. The means simply do not justify the ends, no matter the improvements to our status quo that were made because animal domestication, the means simply cannot be used to justify the ends. For example, slavery and human experimentation helped a lot of people get rich, and support in, for example, experimentation in particular helped a lot of advances that saved millions of lives. However, the above are really bad and are outlawed in society for a reason, because in fact it is principally and morally wrong to support abuse. Therefore, if these things, which benefit the human condition so much, are not allowed, then why should animal experimentation, which we have proven so far is principally and practically incorrect, to be outlawed as well? Secondly, we believe that any of the practical benefits to the improvements the status quo are outweighed as well because of the fact that you simply don't see as many benefits as possible. Even if, like for example, factory farms are not indeed the debate and not all animals are treated in such horrible conditions, it is not about the principle of it. Even if this is true, then we still have a lot of other reasons why these things are principally and practically bad, so proud to propose.
All right. I thank the first proposition speaker for the wonderful remarks. Now, to open the negative case, can we have the leader of opposition?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I would like it if you guys are put in chat. Kind of get distracted easily. So yeah. All right. Starting. Wait, where's my water? Oh, wait, give me a second. Sorry. Sorry. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think Garth lives in an overly idealistic world where just because we don't domesticate animals means we don't use animals anymore. Because I think that on their end, animals, while undomesticated, are still likely to be, to some extent, exploited by humans. Also, just perhaps to a lesser scale. But I think that lesser scale comes at a huge cost to humans itself. And I think that that's the utilitarian scale that we should be talking about in today's debate, right? But first, let's deal with a few things on framing, right? First, very clearly, and I think PM also concedes to this, is that domestication does not equals to mistreatment. And I don't think there's any burden on government to defend animal mistreatment on any level of extent, right? I think even in current existence, the existing moral ethical code that we have towards animal mistreatment is probably realistically good enough reason that like this abuse of animals is something that's highly looked down upon by the rest of society, and that individual people are unlikely to support, and that governments have mobilized to like try to outlaw and actively enforce against, right? And I think that abuse is done whether or not intentional, either it's done intentionally, by which like the current society has like various different kind of mechanisms in like legislation and pressure groups and NGOs to try to like absolve it, or be if it's done unintentionally, then like you can't really fault us for doing that, because like we have no idea that we're conceptualizing these things as abuse within the first place. But second, I'll point out that people have very little incentive and reason to actually abuse animals, right? First, pets have like various degrees of emotional value towards individuals, and people normally take huge amounts of gratification and happiness from seeing pets be happy and be satisfied with their lives. So henceforth, there's very little reason for people to want to abuse pets on the first layer. But on the second layer, even for farm animals, like if you treat farm animals well, they work for longer hours and produce better quality product for you to sell onto the market at the end of the day. Having a healthy chicken and selling that onto the market is cost like $10 extra than having an unhealthy chicken on the market. I think ultimately, like there's just various degrees of reasons on why people are unlikely to abuse animals, or in the case where they abuse animals, that's like the vast minority of the case. Second, pointing out that like just very clearly, wild animals live in complete total misery and are realistically in worse conditions than human conditions, right? Because let's put it in perspective, right? There's a reason why we keep endangered animals in enclosures and try to put them in artificial environments. It's because of the fact that these artificial environments are normally way better than whatever environments that they have out in the wild. These environments are monitored, these environments are taken care of, they have vaccine shots, they have they have steady food supplies. All of these are things in which like domesticated like animals in the wild, they fundamentally lack, right? And that directly leads, right? There is no reason for you to buy into a natural world argument, because it's not structurally proven why is it that the natural world is going to be better. I think that domestication and awareness has also been particularly helpful in developing in developing better conditions for animals overall, right? Because of the fact that like people have been developing parasocial bonds with animals, and like having daily interactions with animals and having better degrees of sympathy with animals. That means that people are likely to support animal legislation to like try to better the condition of animal welfare, just in general. Third, on the argument of exploitation and freedom, and like trying to frame that out, right? First, I just don't think animals care about freedom or liberty or all these various other human philosophical concepts, because the first reason why we're able to domesticate wolves and cows and all of these other animals is because of the fact that they saw us feeding them and they're like, okay, do what you want. I think like very fundamentally, animals do not care about their own personal agency, and therefore I don't think it's in a moral capacity for us to necessarily take that into account at all. I'll take the POI now.
Many farmers inject chickens with steroids and stack them into cages so that they can earn the most money. Is it true that exploitation doesn't exist in the world?
I don't think exploitation doesn't exist. I just think that there are various checks and balances and reasons that you should buy as to why exploitation is A, actively reducing because of what I said about parasocial bonds. B, like realistically not the majority of cases, right? Like it doesn't make sense that most farmers behave like that. But let's say even if it is, and this is where I want to move into the utilitarian level of argumentation, right? I think that you should still prioritize the human condition nonetheless. Because if you don't buy the deontologically like value neutral stuff about how domestication is like perfectly fine. I think that humans just have a higher level of consciousness that you should prioritize above animals. Why is that? First, is that as I stated earlier, animals have no perception of things like social authority, consent, logic, liberty, language. All of these are like structurally prove to us that like animals are just fundamentally not sapient. You can't ask a chicken to sign a contract. The chicken will not consent to working with you for a set degree of hours and then be paid in grain, right? Even the most intelligent dog does not know us by what we are saying, but rather with the tone you're saying. You can tell a dog to sit down and say it in a tone like you're scolding them, and they would not understand that it's sit down. I think that people and humans have actual depth of emotion and thought, and more importantly, even if the actual depth of emotion and thought is parallel, humans have more capacity and ability to voice out and materialize and like crystallize their emotion and thought. At that point in time, it's the priorities of us as humans and us as individuals who understand what humans are saying to prioritize humans as a moral good, right? Why is that so? It's because if you have a moral burden to listen to those who can speak out to you and fulfill their needs as soon as possible, right? So therefore, that the moral burden here is to prove, like the utilitarian burden here is to prove that as long as we can justify that human beings get a better end out of the deal in domestication of animals, I think it's realistically fair for us to say that like it results in good outcomes, right? And I think that domestication has been hugely helpful towards the human condition and the human race, right? I think the first pillar of modern society is like domestication in general, because we're able to develop complex farming societies through agriculture. Without the development of, I don't think like most of modern society would like be created, right? Without having cows to till the land, we would have had to do it by human hand. And if we do it by human hand, productivity goes down, the ability for you to form complex societies go down. All these different values, all these different objective goods out of that. I won't take any more. Out of like reduction in infant mortality rates, vaccines, stable food supplies, all of these are things that you actually actively don't get. What that results in is that I think people under their paradigm probably live in much worse lives, right? What that realistically means is that they never develop to a degree of modern society. We have Stone Age level living persisting under their side, or at the very least early medieval levels of living persisting on their side, right? We have terrible infant mortality rates. People are dying at childbirth. They don't have vaccines. They don't have food supply, stable food supplies. A famine can wipe out a whole entire village. I think that's objectively a terrible thing to be, because you as a human should care about individuals who can complain about things, right? But second, I think that like the advancement rate at which we have seen human society progress is one in which the active conditions of domesticated animals have been hugely uplifted, right? What does that look like? First, I think it looks like a lot of the animals that we used to take for granted for labor and like for like daily use, such as like horses and cows, are realistically taken much better care of in this current state of development, right? Because these are individual, like prioritized commodities and like status symbols. That things are domesticated animals that are like hugely uplifted in society and have standards of living. Second, modern society has allowed us to safeguard a lot against a lot of the abuses that they want to talk about under their side, right? Meaning that like we have complex systems like law, like an understanding of philosophical ethics to try to like mitigate against people who commit atrocities against animals and who try to like persecute these individuals, right? Third is that like, you know, by forming society, we have social pressure against the abuse of domesticated animals. And I'd like to just quickly point out that people aren't unsympathetic to animals. The whole point that this debate can take place is because people are inherently sympathetic to animals. We do see that like these animals express certain degrees of levels of pain, but I think that we just have to deprioritize it, because the fact is, between killing 1 million chicken to feed 1 million people, you will always pick killing 1 million people, 1 million chicken, because of the fact that you don't want the 1 million people to starve. I think the fact is that the existent conditions of second last layer is just that the existing levels of wealth that we have in modern society realistically has resulted in better conditions for animals also, because we develop other technologies such as vaccines, good systems of feeding, etc., that realistically help domesticated animals in every extent. With that, rest my case.
All right. I thank the leader of opposition for the wonderful remarks. Now, to extend on the positive case, can we have the Deputy Prime Minister?
Okay, great. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Great. Okay, let me just set up a timer. Before I begin, I want to clarify I take POIs exclusively verbally, please. I want to be super charitable in my speech. I want to note that animals are stripped of their rights, not only through locking them in pens, but also locking them in houses. Let's take this most charitable case on our side of the house. Even if it's the case where you have only dogs and cats in the world, they don't have free range and choice. Because if we look at it plainly, Dogs and cats are literally locked in a prison known as a house. Their every meal and move is dictated by their human owners, and they are literally treated like objects. Heck, humans can literally choose to put their animals down at the end of their lives in a vet. We say, even in the most charitable of cases, animals are still stripped of their autonomy, they're given no choice and no independence. What is the strategic importance of this claim then? If we prove to you that animals are immorally treated even in the best case scenario, that means that everything underneath falls onto our side of the house. We tell you even in the best case, animals are still mistreated in status quo. 3 parts of my speech, I'm going to be structuring it in the terms of questions. Firstly, why do we owe an obligation to animals? And what is the strategic implication of this? It means that if we prove that animals have a right to receive moral treatment, and that means the current world is immoral because of the atrocities committed through domestication. Note, I want to clarify what domestication looks like right off the bat, because they try to give us an overly optimistic world, one in which animal rights exist. But if you look at the literal farms, the literal factories out there that are slaughtering animals, but even if not in the most extreme cases, the fact that animals are literally confined and have their every move dictated by their human owners is a fundamental mistreatment of these animals and stripping of their autonomy. Animals have a high degree of sentience. They can feel, they have emotions. Anything which is capable of this type of thing deserves rights. E.g., we don't want to torture other people because it causes them pain and suffering. But even if this is not the case, I think we already apply human values to animals, e.g., with dogs and cats and domesticated animals. The reason why we don't apply the same thoughts and rights to other species of animals is because of societal bias. Note, not everything we intuitively believe in society means that it is justified. E.g., we thought slavery was an okay thing 200 years ago, but now obviously it's proven wrong, right? There are certain beliefs that we accept, like such as the domestication of certain types of animals that are okay, which if we examine closely is flawed. On our side of the house, reveal the veil and tell you how horrible it is to treat animals like this. This means that we do intuitively concede that animals qualify for morality. It's just that because of societal bias, we have been gated from applying these to other species of animals. If we think that cats and dogs deserve rights, then pigs who are scientifically proven to be smarter than these animals also deserve rights. But even if we say it is the case that we're not sure whether or not an animal deserves rights, we say that you should play the safer card, not risk violating the rights of animals, especially since the fact that animal rights are so highly contested, meaning that the rights of animals falls in a gray zone where it's hard to confirm whether or not they have a right. E.g., this looks like trying to maximize people's ability to choose a job for themselves in society by having them go to school and providing public education. Because it's better to do this than to hand them a job and hand them a future career, since we don't know what people's preferences are. So we try to maximize people's preferences in order to ensure that they can exercise the full scale of autonomy as much as possible. To this, they say, well, animals don't care, and wolves willingly opted into becoming domesticated. Note, the mechanism, if we examine this plainly, is literally animals took the food of humans and lived by the humans, therefore they must have consented. This ignores the coercive factors involved in doing so. Doing an action doesn't mean you immediately consent to it. E.g., looks like many people are forced to work in factories because it's the only way that which they learn money. Just because they work in these factories doesn't mean that making them work in these conditions is moral. Doesn't mean that they consent to working in these conditions. There are coercive factors which exist outside of that. This looks like many people are scammed of money, but just because they handed the money to the scammer doesn't mean that they consent to having their money be taken away, because there are other coercive factors such as the fact that we're like gaslit by these scammers that are in play here. Last response they give is that morality is attributed to intelligence. 2 things against this. First of all, I want to question, what about the cases of people in comas? These people in comas can't do math. These people in comas have a basic level of brain function where they can barely keep their vital organs functioning. However, we wouldn't say that these people have no rights because they are people. We think that rights is something that goes beyond the fact that you have intelligence or you can exercise the intelligence at the moment, right? Second of all, octopuses are scientifically proven to be basically as smart as humans. Pigs are proven to be smarter than cats and dogs. Why is it the case that we treat them with a different level of respect and morality? Before I move on to the next theme, I'll take the POI. Okay, never mind. Second theme then, on animals, incentives versus humans. Note, the subjugation of animals to domestication and all the pains that come with it aren't necessary towards society. Note this debate exists in a modern context. Lots of what animal domestication is used for nowadays is for human pleasure and overconsumption. Just like, for example, eating your steak every single Saturday. It's not really essential to us to eat steak every single Saturday, right? Even if off proved a degree of harm to humans, we still say this doesn't matter as a whole. Note, morality doesn't work like the incentives of humans slightly weigh over the incentives of animals by 0.5 degree, and therefore we should value the incentives of humans more and disregard the incentives of animals. Different moral systems can exist at the same time. So insofar as we prove the rights of animals at least exist to some extent, and that means we shouldn't just disregard one of the moral systems which value animals. That means we should probably try to uphold it with the moral systems of humans. It's not a trade-off in this debate. Last question then. Why is the state of nature most justified? It is because it is the most fair, right? In this world, people have free choice and autonomy. This is literally why we care about giving people this choice. This is why we care about giving people democracy so that they can express their right within this society, right? I want to give you an example. No matter what the utilitarian outcome is, I say that we care about your autonomy and choice first and foremost. This is like for example, an intuition push. If I hold a gun towards your head and make you study every single day until you get into Harvard, and then you get into Harvard. But even then, I wouldn't say that this is a good or justified action, because no matter what the end result is, I think that it strips you of your autonomy and your choice and therefore isn't moral. Even if there is an animal in the world that is killed by wolves, it is still better than shoving that chicken into the pen and guarantee that they were going to be killed. Because in such a case, we are devoiding them of any autonomy. At least the chicken can try to run away from the wolf in the wild. We strip them of that very basic right in the status quo. At the end of the day, I want to clarify why we win this debate. And we win for a very simple reason. We take them at their best case scenario. We embrace the most charitable case where we're talking about the cats and dogs that live in the pleasures of humans' houses. Even in that case, we prove that autonomy has been stripped of them. But we're not just talking about that. We do need to acknowledge the worst of the world as well. It looks like where animals are mistreating factories. No matter how many NGOs you have, or no matter how many advocates you have, there's still going to be abuses of animals that happen behind the scenes. In either of these worlds, we still win because we prove that animals have a fundamental right, and it's on those bases so proud to propose.
All right, I thank the second proposition speaker for their fine remarks. So to extend the negative case, can we have the deputy leader of opposition?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, 1 minute. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Quickly going into rebuttals, like one of the statements said by proposition is that animals feel threats, like animals feel goals, like animals have long-term goals, or like the freedom for them to choose. This in and of itself is kind of illogical, because first of all, animals do not feel like, do not have wishes, do not have goals, do not have lofty lofty ideals within their lives to be able to achieve. So why do you need the freedom to be why do you need that type of freedom, right? More further explain later. Second is the loss of biodiversity. This in of itself is not our burden to prove, because the loss of biodiversity is not something that is caused by domestication. It's caused by multiple other factors like climate change, overhunting, loss of habitat, and also I will explain more later. And also the And also, the animals deserve rights. Yes, they do. And my first speaker has already told you that we do provide those rights to a certain degree. But freedom, like what is freedom to choose, freedom to be able to like live wild is not a necessity for them to be able to like live proper lives. Also, will be further explained within my speech. Now going into why animals cannot be perceived, like domesticating animals cannot be perceived as like immoral. You do not have the animals do not have the same manner of thought, of feeling, or emotion as human beings, obviously, right? Because you do not you do not feel like if a human were put into slavery, that is completely different. They feel it to a higher degree. They feel stress to a higher degree, to the point where like they are driven to extreme measures like self-harm or like aggression and all those things. Animals simply do not feel emotion and thought and do not think the same way that we do. If this were the truth, then why were animals like domesticated in the first place? Your dog or like your cat or like your cattle would never have been like domesticated in the first place if they did not like if they actually felt aggression, if they actually felt like revenge for humankind. This like entire debate couldn't happen if animals didn't have weren't okay with being domesticated in the first place, or like are okay with receiving the benefits that we humanity give them. So how Okay, and also anthropomorphizing animals and using our standards of what is right and wrong, putting that onto animals cannot be used because uh because baseline, you as an animal yes, feel a certain degree of pain, yes, feel a certain degree of death, and you have very simple ones like not dying, right? But we say that dying in of itself is inevitable. Like humanity will always impose certain humanity will always impose onto animals, like you will hunt these animals, you will kill them for land, you will kill them for food. This is a natural process that you cannot side proposition cannot avoid. So I don't understand how they want to sustain, as said by my first speaker, I don't know how you want to sustain yourselves if you're not going to be able to kill these animals, right? And we say on our side is way better because we have humane ways of the humane ways of breeding these animals and containing these animals to prevent them from being subject to the effects of the wild and so forth. Um, um okay, okay. So what does this mean, right? Well, so what does this mean? You cannot say that the animal standard is the same as human beings. The ones are simple, mainly being no death or less pain. You already cannot provide no death because you're going to kill them anyways, and less pain, we are able to achieve that because pain is symmetrical on both sides. You can't avoid that. Once you put these animals into domestication, you're able to provide a safe environment for them, or at least a relatively safe environment for them, and prolong their lives in of itself. And this is why I say that even if you want to preserve or let's say prevent animals from going extinct, we do that better in of itself. Why? Because the close proximity with human beings, the closer an animal species is to a human being, the more chance they have to build parasocial relationships or a connection with human beings, right? They rely on you, they accept you, they want you in their homes. Why is this good? Because as a whole, you get better chances at living or surviving with the human species than trying to tough it out in the wild. There are a lot of things that you cannot avoid as an animal in the wild. So disease, global warming, loss of habitat. This is the things that side proposition does not account for. And at the end of the day, the alternative, living in the wild, is way more harmful than being kept in captivity, because there are things like parasitic funguses that eat animals and leave them unable to feed, leave them in pain for months on end and up until the point of death. We as humans are able to provide sterile, a constant degree of quality of life for these animals, regardless of all other circumstances, right? Because we're able to provide them food, medicine, so on and so forth. Okay, so how does this benefit necessarily happen? Okay, I'll explain it to you. Okay, so the impact of this like captivity, right, is that generally they live longer lives. They live longer lives, they live healthier lives, they live better lives because of the like treatment and the care that we give them. So they really live in a relatively safe environment. Side proposition is trying to inflate the conditions in which most animals are held. Yes, there's always going to be abuse and like mistreatment to some degree, but you cannot say that this is the case for every single animal, and most animals are being treated with a level of care. So all in all, the standards of living for these animals are actually quite good as compared to the alternative, aka living in the wild, trying to fend for yourselves. So even if suffering is possible on both sides, it is better for animals to be domesticated, like to preserve the animals, like to preserve the animals from extinction in and of itself, right? Because climate change exists, global warming exists, and all of these things that cannot be avoided on either side. Okay, also to address the one argument said by proposition earlier on, why people in comas are treated like inhumanely. This is kind of a weird comparison because humans that are in comas have been alive or have the potential to be alive. And even if they don't ever wake up, they still have families that care for them, that feel for them, that feel that level of stress and loss to a certain degree, where it's devastating, where you can lose financial stability, emotional stability, and all these things. You cannot treat these you cannot compare for someone to be in a coma to animals being like kept as pets, for example. Why do you use this comparison where there's a completely flip comparison on our side where abortion is a thing? You as a clump of cells, technically that thing is somewhat human, right? Why are you able to just abort it? Why is the mother given a choice to abort this child when it's technically a human? And with that, I rest my case. Thank you.
All right, I thank the speaker for the wonderful remarks. Now, to conclude the constructive debate for proposition, can we have the government?
Heather, can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, I'll take my POIs verbally, please. Time begins on my first word. In the 1900s, people with a higher amount of melanin in their skin were denied the basic right to freedom. And today, we believe that was an immoral act of the government to deny them that freedom. That whether your skin was black or white was out of your control. So we thought what mattered more was the traits that people could control. Up from first to third, our claim that has still been vaguely responded to by opposition was that whether you had tentacles or legs as your limbs, you ought to be not denied the basic right to live a virtuous life. And opposition's very rhetoric in this debate is a lot of reminiscent of governments that practice Jim Crow laws, and we're not going to stand for that. Ultimately, what mattered in this debate was whether or not there was a suitable difference between animals and humans. We believe there wasn't. We're very, very proud to propose. There's two questions I want to ask in this debate. Number one, is animal domestication morally correct? Secondly, is it the case that we create a better world still on proposition? Firstly, is animal domestication morally correct? And right off the bat, the strategic importance of this question is that this is what is going to decide your ballot in this debate. Because ultimately, as we pointed out from first, this was a principled argument and this was a principled debate. That ultimately, it wasn't about whether or not humans deserve to develop better, but was whether or not they ought to deserve that right to develop in the first place. We told you, if that development was founded off of inhumane practices where you treated animals as an ends to the means to an ends, we believe that was morally wrong. So the first thing I want to ask then is, how is animal domestication done and why is it done horribly? The first thing I want to note is that animal domestication is done horribly for two reasons. The first reason is because in order to keep up with human demand, domestication has become increasingly inhumane. Human populations have been increasing, and therefore we needed more eggs than ever and more wool to supply shirts than ever. And as a result, farmers decided to cut costs on humaneness. So for example, they put chickens into eggs and injected chickens with steroids in order to make sure that they grow the most eggs and grow the most meat. So as a result of that, in order to keep up with increasing human populations, their side already had an incentive in terms of capitalism to already make and cut costs, increasing in humaneness. The second reason as to why animal domestication is done horribly, though, is because with the rise of machinery, more animals have been put to death for food, as opposed to actually doing things that actually kept their aliveness in the first place. So, for example, Instead of using bulls now to actually move tractors, we have built tractors that move by themselves. And as a result, now most bulls are just killed when they're only 12 months old. As a result of what I just proved, that probably means you do not have the checks and balances that first opposition asserts you do have. Because in order for them to actually meet that demand, many farmers have gone to governments and said that we need to inject chickens with steroids and we need to kill an inhumane amount of bulls in order to continue keeping up with this human demand, which is why lobbying has been increasingly powerful, and it is why in practice, you have seen tons of inhumane treatment within factory farms already. What that proves then is why checks and balances actually do not exist, and why the actual treatment of animals within these factory farms and within domestication is actually incredibly inhumane. And all that serves to prove then is an additional reason for why you do not have checks and balances, and for that reason as to why this is bad to treat people as a means to an end. The second thing I want to ask is whether or not animals are sentient. And this is very important because this proves as to why we deserve to give these people good rights. The first thing they say is that many animals are incapable of complex logical thought. This is not true. Octopuses, as Kathy explained, have been scientifically proven to be smarter than most human infants. But not only is that true, our claim extended further than that we have given those with mental disabilities the rights of a human, even if they're incapable of doing basic human functions. So many people who are coma patients have still received the basic right to life, even if it's the case that they cannot eat and they're living in a pain of suffering. We do this because we gave them the right to life because they were human. But notably, if that's the case, because they have a similar amount of sentience, we ought to give that right towards those who are also scientifically proven to have the same type of sentience. So the reason why pigs are also proven to be smarter than most 2-year-olds probably still stands true. And therefore, sentience is true within most animals, and it's additional reason for why these people should be respected for that sentience in the first place. The final thing I want to do then is weigh this against development. Because opposition's largest claim is that you have human development. What I want to prove is why Sarina's first argument about why this is principally important already outweighs that already. The first thing they say is that ops argue, their main argument was about human development. But firstly, we already gave you plenty of responses. Notably, a lot of human development actually isn't what opposition wants to paint it at. It's rather, instead of actual innovation and actual building off of things, you see a lot of overconsumption. Kathy already pointed out, there's no reason for why people need to eat steaks every Saturday, and that's not necessarily necessary for development, yet that still happens a lot of times in practice. So for them to say that animal domestication is good because it leads to development is probably shaky because a lot of it is actually overconsumption instead of innovation. The second thing we told you was that this is the same type of rhetoric that governments have used to practice discrimination. In terms of the Jim Crow laws, we have ignored circumstances of people's birth. And as a result of that, a lot of us believed it was immoral of the Jim Crow laws to even exist because they ignored people's circumstances. The people didn't get to choose to be whether or not they were born as white or black, and therefore it was harmful to punish them for it. Similarly, it's wrong for us to punish animals for their plight. And the reason why is because, as we put it in John Rawls' theory, many animals did not get to choose as to whether or not they were born as a human or an animal. That very simply, if you were a human and if the average intelligent voter was a human and they were actually born under our world as an animal, most people would probably agree that they themselves shouldn't be treated inhumanely. That similarly, if most humans were born as animals and were put into the very factory farms on opposition's world, most of them would live a pain of suffering. And therefore, based off of the veil of ignorance and based off the fact that people don't get to choose the circumstances of their birth, we believe it is principally right to not have animal domestication in the first place. The second form of weighing is that on magnitude, all animals, whether they're in factory farms or in households, are treated terribly. And this takes opposition at their best case scenario. Whether you're a household pet or whether you're a pig starving off within a cage farm, all of these animals have their basic right to freedom removed. That just because I put you a gun to your head and you got to Harvard doesn't necessarily mean that getting into Harvard was a good thing if you didn't have the choice to get into it. And as a result, we believe that freedom of choice is actually dependent on whether or not you do get the benefits in hindsight. So for second opposition just to come up here and say, we gave these animals good medicine and we have helped them succeed and live isn't necessarily important if you do not have the consent of these animals in the first place. Before I move on to the second question about development, I'll take POI if there is one.
Can you explain what animals would do with the freedom that you give them on your side?
Yeah, I would assume that animals just live up their life happy. On your side of the house, they're just actively sad because on your side, they do not have any freedom and they're constantly injected with steroids against their own will. on our side these animals, even if it's a case that they might be put in danger, which is a small actual risk considering that many animals might just come across a wolf by happenstance. On your side of the house, many animals are killed when they're 12 months old, which means that the actual risk of death on your side of the house actually is more important and is more likely than on our side. The second thing I want to ask then is whether or not we create a better world. Opposition 2 makes the assumption that we have provided animals with good standards of living. Given the framing I've done since the start of my speech as to why animal domestication is done inhumanely, this is probably not true. In fact, we probably inject them with steroids that makes it so that their own body feels incredibly heavy. It makes it so that they cannot move as much, and it makes it so that they live their life actually with breathing problems because many of them have their muscles too big to be injected. Secondly, is that they say they get human development. Not only have I outweighed this claim in the first question, though, it's unclear as to why this is true. We use machinery now to do very basic things like mining, and we use tractors to mow around fields. It's unclear as to why animals in all of those cases are going to be benefited or why animals were super important in the first place. So under all of those bases, we believe that animals are the same as humans, and we're very, very proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the third proposition speaker for their speech. Now to conclude the constructive debate for opposition, can we have the opposition whip speaker?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, cool. Sorry, me. All right. Okay. So hi, my name's Amin. No preferred gender pronouns. I'll take POIs verbally. I don't really read chat, so just turn on your mic if you have a POI. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First point of response before moving into few points of clarification, then on to clashes. The first is on the entire idea of how in the status quo currently animals are being mistreated. I think from the very get-go, we've already provided to you multiple different reasons as to why farmers and other individuals would not mistreat animals, because one, there's a specific demand for animals that have been treated better, because oftentimes it means that you have better quality product. But secondly, and most importantly, it means you have laws in order to prevent these animals from being mistreated. They tell us, oh, farmers will lobby for things like worse animal treatment. We argue there's counter lobbying from animal rights activists and other groups to ensure that these animals get fair treatment, right? We would argue that in the vast majority of instances, especially with the progression of things like media and media and awareness for certain animal rights, is the reason as to why currently we have these animal rights or laws and legislation to prevent against animal cruelty in the first place. The reason as to why we're having this debate today is because we somewhat have an idea that animals deserve some form of civility. The question then is to what extent those rights extend to, and whether or not those would in retrospect, this domestication was necessarily something that was moral or not. First point of clarification then on what necessarily the grounds are for determining morality or whether or not individuals deserve rights. We've argued from first that oftentimes the extent to which individuals deserve rights is not necessarily just on things like intelligence, as per what Prop wants to argue. We would argue that the capacity to make choice was necessarily also something that you had to take into account. But let's talk about intelligence for a second, right? They tell us, or use an analogy, that individuals in a coma, we still treat them with morality. We would argue, one, my second speaker has already told you, at the point in which you had a choice before and after, that capacity to make choice was necessarily the reason as to why you were able to treat these individuals with morality, because you recognize that these individuals had that capacity to make choice before, and you're acting in that best decision based on informed decisions of their previous choice. So you can determine what exactly they would have wanted in these instances, and that's on what basis you operate for these individuals then. But we would argue that if individuals are 100% brain dead, i.e. no intelligence, as per what Prop wants to argue, we would argue that in these instances, oftentimes you already let these people go. You cannot do anything about them. So oftentimes families will just move on from this individual. So I don't see why then intelligence is necessarily something that you have to you cannot disregard for these individuals then. But let's talk about more about like the ability for you to get rights and capacity for choice then, right? Firstly, like why exactly do octopuses not necessarily have rights? One, we think octopuses are kind of out of the debate because we don't really domesticate octopuses. But two, even if they have these high levels of intelligence, we would argue that the right to liberty is only important at the point in which you have the capacity to make choice with that liberty. I think third prop gives us a really weird answer or a really vague answer to what exactly dogs would do with their liberty. The answer he gave is simply too vague for us to actually value when he tells us, oh, our dogs would just live happily and go live their life happily if we let them go. I don't think your dog would want to live a life in which he had to work a 9 to 5 or would want to like go to Harvard, right? I don't necessarily see the ability for this this dog to make that informed choice or the capacity to make that choice in the first place. Note the analogy to literal slavery for other humans was not analogous because these humans had the capacity for choice to begin with. At the point in which you had the capacity to make this choice, it was an important decision for you. It was an important right for you to have that liberty, because if you were confined out of that choice, it meant that you couldn't express the things that you wanted to do, or you couldn't live the life to your fullest. The distinction that we made under opposition was made clear from the start. The fact that dogs and wolves were domesticated in the first place was because of the fact that they wanted to be, or they couldn't opt out of that domestication to begin with. The fact that they couldn't make that choice or didn't have that capacity for choice in the first place means that the right to liberty, even if granted, was not necessarily something that they could exercise at the end of the day. Next, let's talk about clashes, right? Firstly, on utilitarian outcomes. Note that my first speaker already talked about a lot of utilitarian outcomes and why that was necessarily important. Note that the response to this was really minimal. We don't really hear any form of deadlock break for this argument on utilitarian outcomes, on why necessarily it was important for you to develop human society, because it meant the fact that humans could be better off at the end of the day. The reason as to why this argument is so important and debate winning is because we were able to prove to you that the point in which you are able to maximize the amount of happiness, maximize the amount of utility for humans, that was necessarily something that was beneficial. But I'm going to take it one layer further. Because of the fact that the way we base morality is because of the emotions of humans, we would argue that, one, because of the fact that we are the dictators of morality; two, the fact that we have a higher level of emotional understanding; three, we have higher levels of choice. We would argue that the ability for you to have utility as a human increases the ability for you to be happy. Because of the fact that would argue that utility is somewhat analogous to morality, because it allows for the vast majority of individuals under our side of the house to be happier, we would argue in retrospect, without the ability for you to domesticate animals, to develop things like technology, as per what third prop wants to argue, the ability for you to achieve this amount of utility wouldn't actually be available under their side of the house at the point in which you couldn't domesticate these individuals. But what exactly was the outcome then for animals, right? If they wanted to argue about, because this is a debate about animals, right? Which actually gives you the best outcome for animals then? They argue that animals would be better off in the wild. But note, we have already given you substantial reasons as to why this wasn't necessarily the case in the first place. The fact that the wild is much more harsher. You are plagued with disease. You are plagued with other animals that are actively trying to kill you. And note, thirdly, that we've also told you that the reliance on animals exists whether or not domestication still occurs under their side of the house or not. The fact that you still are going to hunt for animals, I think the humane killing methods that we have currently that exist because of domestication are much better than literally throwing a spear at wild cows that hurt them even more, right? I think the level of pain that you are going to achieve, the level of pain that is achieved under that house is much higher, and therefore if pain is the metric of immorality under their side of the house, side op takes the debate on that. But even if they want to say that pain under our side of the house was necessarily something that was worse off, we would argue that pain is necessarily just a response system. Because oftentimes we would argue that under our side of the house, note that you have things like new technologies such as electric shock systems to humanely kill animals, right? But the problem is pain is not necessarily something that you can observe in order to determine your capacity for rights in the first place? Because a lot of other things also have a capacity to feel pain, right? Plants feel pain, viruses feel pain. These are biological response systems that don't necessarily affect your emotional or liberty to do things in the first place. We would argue that your capacity in order to make these choices was necessarily the thing you had to base these rights on. For all those reasons, side with all.
Right, I thank the speaker for the speech. That brings us to the end of the constructive debate. Now, to start the reply round, can we have the opposition reply speaker?
Okay, okay, my water went somewhere again. Okay, never mind. You're gonna start. In 3, 2, 1. I'm a tree-hugging, plastic recycling, tote bag taking hippie, but I don't think that animal domestication is still ultimately bad, right? And I think comparing our rhetoric to like Jim Crow is a bit icky coming from side proposition, right? But let's talk about it. Because I think proposition needs to debate in reality land instead of debate land, right? Because I think parts of their case argument is like precipice on a simplistic understanding of what the real world actually reflects. Because the layers of argument is because people want money, they will abuse animals without actually taking into account that before you can abuse animals, there are multiple layers of like levels of societal reasons why you are structurally prevented from abusing animals, and there are multiple reasons on why you shouldn't abuse animals because there are other co-current demands, right? I think at the end of the day, opposition just argues a much more realistic picture, right? There are reasons for why people will not abuse animals. There are reasons on why legislation works and why legislation exists in the current modern status quo that we're trying to defend, right? But let's talk about the three main clashes, but let's resolve this debate by three main questions, right? First, are humans and animals on the same level of sapience? Are humans and animals on the same level of sapience? And is that relevant to the debate? I think props arguments here are sufficient to establish that animals are capable of some level of cognitive operations. But like, it's unresponsive, right? Because we don't argue that these animals don't have sapience. We just argue that humans have a larger level of sapience and ability to express that sapience, henceforth they should be prioritized because we as humans would understand our fellow human beings' sapience more. With that, I think like the ability for individuals to have complex logical functions and the comparative lack of that is just to say that like even if they want to argue that some animals have like some level of higher degrees of understanding, one, the upper limits of that is way below a normally functioned adult human being. But second is that most animals do not have that complex logic. They've been cherry picking their examples using octopi and fucking pigs the whole debate. I don't understand why their arguments should be based on that and why you should buy that entirely. I think you can still buy the idea that like at a fundamental level of being, there is a level of priority here and it should always be humans before animals. Second, is it important for these animals without sapience and like full logical cognitive function to have freedom of choice? I think Whip already puts it into very crystallized form, into telling you why exactly like animals cannot make good choices, like cannot have like a multitude of choices or would not make a multitude of choices. Their choices are pissing and shitting. I don't think they have much else to pick between them, right? But even if they're able to pick more, I think that you still have to go for humans because humans have larger degrees of ability to do choice, and hence their liberty should be placed above animals. Last thing, what is the utilitarian like weighing, and why is it that opposition sides always wins over proposition? It's because the fundamental pillar of society is domestication has been set up since first opposition, right? And I don't think any side in proposition tries to argue against this because the fundamental agreement is that in order to have modern society, you have to have early Neolithic, like agrarian, like agricultural societies. You have to have those early phases of development. And without the ability for animals to step in for human labor, without the ability of large-scale domestication, allowing for agriculture to come up to maintain food supplies, you don't have modern society. Hence, of all the benefits you get from protection of animals, then lifting of their like standards of living, and all of the various different benefits towards humankind that you get, are things that they don't necessarily get on their side, right? You have no modern society, it means you have no tech to replace labor using technology. You have no protection of animal laws because there are no laws or fundamentally good and complex systems of legal solutions. And that you do not have all of this knowledge that you have in the current day to maintain that animals have a good way, that we have a good way of ending animals' lives and maintaining that they live out humane existences before we kill them and eventually eat them either ways under both ends, right? I think propositions vote so far looks like this. We are all like stuck in early phases of human development. Animals live in the wild, they die in the wild, they live a fairly uneventful life, they are plagued by disease. And our end, we have modern society, animals who want to be domesticated and are domesticated probably live better lives on our comparative. I raise my case.
All right, I thank the speaker for their remarks. Now to conclude the entire debate, can we have the governed by speaker?
Okay, great. Let me just get a drink of water. Animals live in a world where they are subjugated by their human oppressors, which can decide their every single move. They are locked in 4-foot pens from the moment of their birth, and their very bodies are engineered to produce more weight than their legs can handle, rendering them unable to even move to the water bowl. On side proposition, we say it's high time we open our eyes and see the suffering that we have caused these animals. This speech will be structured into questions. First of all, what are our pushes in the debate? I think we've been very charitable from the beginning of our speeches. First, we characterize to you a realistic world. Even with the existence of NGOs and animal rights activists, most people are still rubbing their stomachs after being filled with a quarter pounder from McDonald's. Animals are stripped of their autonomy and put into pens. They're going to be on no matter how many NGOs exist in the world. The second world which we engage in is extremely charitable, and we have heard no response to it. It doesn't matter whether or not we are treating these animals in a humane way, because even the cat which lives in the safety of the human owner's house has no ability to opt out. We say that choice is something that we should value irregardless of utilitarianism. Even if you get into Harvard, even if that happens, if someone is pushing you by threatening you with a gun, we say that is immoral. So utilitarianism doesn't matter so long as you are stripped of your autonomy. Second thing we prove to you is that animals deserve rights. Opposition's claim under this is that animals are not intelligent as humans. We tell you two things in response. First of all, that many animals are smart. Note, this isn't just confined to octopuses. This is like, for example, pigs that are slaughtered by the masses. We care about, but second of all, we tell you that we don't care just about intelligence, because that's why people with mental disabilities have the same rights as everybody else, because we know that morality is something that we should attribute to everybody, that everybody deserves to be treated in a humane way. But additionally, an evaluation of rights under the pretense of intelligence is highly flawed in of itself. This is really reflective of what US politicians said to justify eugenics during the rise of IQ tests. They can literally say to call out the lesser and the lesser intelligence. We say that this is fundamentally wrong to judge people off of such a metric. It's not about whether animals have more or less sentience than humans, because both have sentience. Morality isn't just we choose to either give humans or animals rights if we prove that both deserve rights, at least to some degree. So even if we take the worst case scenario and say that animals are not as deserving of rights as humans, we still say that they're deserving of rights because we still prove a margin that they have sentience and have a deserving of morality. Second thing we tell you is that the alternative world is better. At least on our side, we have more autonomy. Even if it's the case that animals want to piss and shit their entire lives, we still say it's a great thing because at least they have the freedom to piss and shit instead of being controlled by the owners. To this, they respond that animals would choose to be domesticated instead. We gave you several responses throughout the courses of 3 speeches. First of all, I'm confused why animals would want to be genetically engineered to a degree which they grow so fat they're unable to stand. This point that they propose is restant on the assumption that animals would enjoy their life. But we tell you the vast majority of cases, there's a lot of abuses of animals that go on. Second of all, we say that you should play safer and not risk violating the rights of animals, since we can't be sure of their incentives. Even at the worst case scenario, if we can't confirm what animals want, we want to maximize the choice that animals have to choose for what they actually want. So this is why we try to keep coma patients alive, since they're not confident in what they want, and therefore we should keep them alive in order to maximize the choice. The last thing we say is not all animals will consent. Not all animals want to be domesticated. However, on their side of the house, all animals are locked in the system. Our side is one which guarantees that these animals are able to exercise their basic right of freedom and choice. For that, so proud to propose.
All right, I thank the speaker for the speech, and that brings us to the end of the debate. Cross for shake hands. I think you guys are are they supposed to stay here or they're supposed to go to the main audi?
No, they go to the main hall and then announcements happen when they happen.
All right, cool.